probably the best introduction I've ever had. Thank you. Wow. Well, thank you all for coming. This is actually the best attendance I've had for anything I've ever done while working at UT. I took a picture to show my students, see, come to class, even when it's raining. Well, thank you for having me. Again, my name is David Scott. I do live in Longview. We are going to be talking today about modern slavery and human trafficking. What I've done in this presentation, because I've only got an hour, is to basically give you an overview of what's happening around the globe. I'm going to narrow it down to Texas, and then I've actually done a study in East Texas over the last couple of years with some partner agencies and run some data analysis on how domestic minor sex trafficking is happening right here in Tyler. It's happening in Longview, happening in Lindale, and more often than not, it's happening in plain sight. We just don't know what we're looking at until somebody makes an outcry or until police get involved. So I'm going to show you guys some just very basic results of some stats we have, some studies we've been doing, and we'll go from there. I don't have a clicker today, I apologize. I've got 7 kiddos and they tend to get in my bag and things disappear, but I did find a cookie or half-eaten cookie in there this morning, so we call that evidence in criminal justice. Okay, so we're going to get into modern slavery and human trafficking. A quick shout out to some of my friends that helped me make this presentation possible. Kim Basinger is a registered sexual assault nurse examiner. She's also a friend of mine, and we teach a three-day sexual assault family violence investigator course to law enforcement around the state. It is not the actress, it's a totally different Kim Basinger. Okay? I'm not Michael Keaton or Batman, I'm not that cool. Elizabeth Wolf, who's a friend of ours, and then locally I want to help our friends, thank our friends for the Silent and the Texas Municipal Police Association for helping me put all this together. So just to give you an overview of what we're talking about, human trafficking, as we're looking at vulnerable populations, there aren't people running around like you see on NCIS and CSI Tyler and CSI Longview and CSI whatever, and Blue Bloods where there's a van and they're getting a big net and snatching up a bunch of kids. That's Hollywood. In fact, most of my job is Hollywood on TV. We don't do nearly any of that stuff in real life. And one of the things I try to tell my students when they come into a class, especially criminal investigations, or if it's a profiling class or something like that, they all want to go to the FBI, they all want to hunt down Hannibal Lecter and all this other stuff. I said, okay, that's great. Just be prepared to do some paperwork, be prepared to work with the public, and be prepared to figure out that we're not going to have all this solved in an hour. We're not going to have it by the next commercial break. All right, these investigations are long, they're intensive. We have a lot of failures, we have some success on bringing these guys to justice. It's a very complicated road when we work a human trafficking case. But just to give you an example, first of all, men, women, and children, anyone can be victims of human trafficking. Okay, it's basically getting them to do something against their will that they normally would not want to do voluntarily. That's the short version of it. Runaways and children or kids in foster care for child exploitation, child labor, that is their biggest target area. Victims of physical, sexual abuse, drug addicts, alcoholics, immigrants right now at the border, I'll show you some stats on that in a little bit. Impoverished people, hungry, poor, and dead, and people with juvenile criminal history. This is our area right here. In Longview, Tyler, anywhere around the state really, kids that are deemed at risk, 1 in 3 will be contacted by a pimp or forced into prostitution every time they run away. That's the stat. So forever, our goal was, come on in. He's doing the walk of shame. Hurricane rain. What happens is we, back in the day, being in law enforcement, one of the calls we used to roll our eyes at is, locate runaway, bring runaway home and all that. And after a while, we started getting some really good training from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and they were like, why are you taking him home so fast? I said, well, because we want to get them home, we want to do a report, we got 6,000 other things waiting for us on our call sheet, we got 911 calls coming in. And they said, well, 40% of these kids are running away from something. So we slowed down a little bit, and we started talking to these kids, saying, okay, look, you've run away for the nth time, you've been truant for the nth time, what's going on? And lo and behold, we were getting outcries, lots of outcries. Well, so-and-so's touching me at home, so-and-so's forcing me to do this, I'm starving, my parents are drug addicts and all that. Well, then we decided we had to change our strategy. Instead of rushing to get that kid home or rushing to put that kid back in foster care, we had to start coming up with a plan B, all the way to plan Z sometimes, to basically ensure safety for our victims. So the types of human trafficking that we see today: forced marriage, child soldiers in third world countries, forced labor, and no, that's not me grounding my kids, by the way, don't accuse me of that, debt bondage, and sex trafficking. Just to kind of break down the types of slavery we look at, there's begging and trinkets selling on the side of the road. How many of you guys have seen these folks everywhere? I think there's a sign somewhere in the US that says come to Longview, because they're like on every corner. Austin's got a problem with it, Dallas. Some of them are legitimately paying off a debt, or they're working for someone, forced to go out there and, say I'll wrestle for food or something like that, money. Agriculture down in the valley. Other sexual services, adult prostitution, child prostitution, service marriage, restaurant employees. A lot of people that are working in the kitchen, dishwashers, and other types of manual labor back in these kitchens, they're basically being trafficked. And what's amazing for us in law enforcement, one of the key things was we'd go to these restaurants, our lunch break or dinner break or breakfast break, depending on what shift you were working, and if you noticed that the kitchen staff was changing a lot, that was kind of a red flag for us. I'm like, well, who would quit these jobs and what's going on? And what they're doing is they're working off their debt for a little bit, and then they're moving on to the next restaurant, and moving on to the next restaurant. And real quickly, we started hearing bells and whistles going off in our head that we probably need to investigate this a little harder. Domestic servitude, nannies, maids, sweatshops, show you a couple pictures of that in a little bit. And of course, the one we always think about is prostitution. I'm going to jump over this little 5-minute video because I'm short on time here. If we have time, we'll go back and see it. It's just an overview of slavery. So human trafficking is modern day slavery, period, the end. They are synonymous with each other, whether you're an adult or a child. It is slavery. It is modern day. It is probably the largest, we're starting to see the largest numbers of reported slavery for human trafficking than we ever have in American history. Even before the Civil War, we have more and more kids and people coming forward. It doesn't matter if they're coming in from California or the East Coast or down from Mexico or over the Canadian border, we're starting to see more and more people identify in this particular target population. So to break it down for you in terms of money, criminal enterprise supported by high demand for both locally and globally. It is the third most profitable transnational criminal activity behind drugs and arms. Estimated profits around $32 billion annually for any trafficking organization. Victims are viewed as reusable commodities. They're not human beings. Profit is made through the selling of human beings and forced services as human beings. Nearly every country in the world is affected by human trafficking. Human trafficking has fast become a growth industry in the criminal syndicates. Different organized criminal and crime groups are responsible for various phases of human trafficking. Continue, but I'll talk more about that in a second. And by the way, if you have a question or comment, this is a dialogue. Don't think it's a monologue, me lecturing to my students. Talk to me. If you got a question or a story, or go ahead.
Is debt bondage?
Debt bondage. I'm going to give you that definition in just a minute. It's basically you're working to pay off a debt for someone smuggling or bringing you over to the country illegally. And if you don't do it, then they typically threaten to kill your family back in your home country or something like that. So, good question. We'll talk about it. See, it works. You asked the question, I answered. It's okay. Put that on my evaluation. All right. Traffickers are continually adapting to their tactics. The use of internet makes detection more difficult for law enforcement. Forever, we had this website called Backpage. Anyone ever hear of Backpage? Okay. It was like the hot spot for human trafficking. It was a dating app, and you could sell stuff. And inside, you could put layers and layers and embed pictures and all that. And eventually, law enforcement, the FBI, Secret Service, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Interpol, quickly realized that Backpage was just that. It was a backdoor for human trafficking. So they eventually shut it down. And that was a huge win for us on one front. But the traffickers that didn't get caught, they went somewhere else. So now we're back at square one. We're like, well, maybe we should have left it up a little bit longer so we could start tracking more of these syndicates. So they just moved. They went underground, and they're using the dark web, and they're on Facebook and Snapchat, Instagram. They're everywhere right now. Let's see here. Internet and social media are used by traffickers for recruitment, solicitation, and buying and selling of victims of sex and labor services. Okay, so how this whole trafficking initiative got started was around 2000. We had the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or the TVPA. The goal was to take a national and global stance against trafficking. We knew this was a problem. We didn't understand the magnitude of it 19 years ago. But in general, it was set to provide protection and services for trafficking victims, hold traffickers accountable, and work to prevent trafficking around the world. So what we've tried to do is unite and connect. International laws and US federal laws and even Texas state laws started kind of merging together. So if we had a case in Texas and we can prove they came over Texas state lines to be trafficked or prostituted here in Texas, we could go federal. If we could show they came in from an international border, we could go beyond that. And what we wanted to do is have an open line of communication with the various levels of government so we could effectively prosecute and hold offenders accountable. And it's been working. We don't get a whole lot of media attention about it. I think they prefer it that way. But we start getting more and more local traffickers who are giving up the big traffickers. We're starting to see things overseas where we're freezing assets. We're having multinational groups come together in coalitions and trying to shut them down. So it's really big and above what's going on here in Tyler and Longview most of the time. Okay, so the TVPA defines acts of severe forms of trafficking as, and I apologize for the small lettering, the recruitment, harboring, and transportation or provision or obtaining of a person for the purpose of commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. In Texas, we're looking at child prostitution as a minor under the age of 18. Period, the end. They can be 17 years and 12 months and 31 days and 59 minutes and 59 seconds old. Under 18 is the definition of minor for trafficking. Those age 18 or over who are forced, deceived, or coerced into providing commercial sex acts. Children and adults forced to perform labor or services through force, fraud, and coercion. Okay, so earlier you had a question about some of these definitions. I'm slowly getting to your question. So all we have to think about in Texas, and what I love about Texas is I'm not a native Texan, but I've been here since I was about 5, so I guess that makes me an honorary Texan. We keep things simple here in Texas. Not simple dumb, but simple for us to implement and execute these laws. Okay, and so do the federal statutes, which is a saving grace when it comes to human trafficking or child abuse or domestic violence. Improvement, harboring, transporting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. All I have to do is, typically in this type of work right here, I'd have 3 people arrested. I'd have the person that did the recruiting, then I'll pick on you because you relate. Let's say you're harboring them, okay? And let's say you've got a van out back and you're transporting them, but now we got engaging in organized crime. 2 or more people committing the same crime. But typically it's going to be it's like a jigsaw puzzle. We're going to look for the pieces of everyone who had their fingerprints on this crime, whether they did something, recruited, or if they tried to receive a benefit from it, they're going to be tied up in this. So it's almost like a spider web. It can almost get really, really convoluted until we start fleshing out who did what and where. Commercial sex act is any sex act in which anything of value is exchanged. Everyone thinks it's money. We've had cases where it was property, guns, narcotics, kids for kids, victims for victims. They just swapped out the victims. Anything that somebody holds of value, that basically becomes that currency. Bitcoins right now, how many of you guys have heard of Bitcoins? That's all the new rage right now in human trafficking online, Bitcoins. Involuntary servitude is induced by means of any plan intended to cause a person to believe that that person did not continue in such a condition, that person or another would suffer abuse or harm. So for example, you have someone working in a sweatshop for 18 hours a day, making about 1 cent on the dollar for every hour they work. And if they stop working, refuse to work, or run away, the person in charge will make a phone call back to their country and either threaten to have their family killed or have their family killed if they don't keep working it off. Okay? Now everyone's like, well, 1 cent, 2 cents on the dollar. They're never going to be able to pay this debt bondage off because there's usually like 400 or 500% interest on it. So they're literally working in a black hole. They're never going to get out of it. All right, panage is holding someone against his or her will to pay off the debt. Debt bondage, here's your definition, my friend. Condition arising from a pledge by a debtor of their personal services as a security for the debt, the length of which are not limited or defined. Sounds like parenthood. I'm kidding. Oh, we're recording this. Sorry, honey, it's a joke. Love you. All right, threats of serious harm against any person, any plan intended to cause a person to believe failure to a person of an act that would result in serious harm. And then we have to define serious harm. And, okay, which one?
Court of Appeals.
Court of Appeals, okay. You look familiar.
Jim Morgan.
Oh, good, Dave Scott, good to see you. Who else? I saw another hand go up. Attorney? Okay. Nobody on the back? Great, now I'm being audited. That's awesome. No pressure. We have to show intent. And if we are using our case basis, basically for like with a child or an adult, on emotional and psychological abuse, it's a hard case, because how do I show you, say I got a jury panel right here, how do I show you that this person was psychologically scarred or psychologically conditioned or coerced to do what they did, and try to convince you that it was not intentional of their own free will? Now, with domestic violence and abuse and all that, it's easy. I look for bruises, I look for cuts, I look for strangulation marks, I look for all that stuff. But with human trafficking, we have to kind of put out these breadcrumbs, so to speak, and please feel free to disagree with me if you see anything. But we have an uphill battle, because I have to show, so I have to convince a jury, or we have to, not me, but the attorney and prosecutor, and even law enforcement with enough probable cause to say, yes, this girl was prostituted, but she was so infatuated, conditioned, psychologically to be so codependent on the pimp or trafficker that it was not uncommon for her to leave the house voluntarily, do her job, and come back to him without having to be with an ankle monitor or being followed or stalked. She was conditioned that way. And sometimes we have to bring in an expert, that's a psychiatrist, child psychologist, something like that, to help explain. A lot of everyone thinks it's Stockholm Syndrome, and in a way it is. I don't like using Stockholm Syndrome that much as a term, because there's a lot more to that, but having to explain that, and then having your average officer, try to put that together in a report, and then it goes through CID or detectives and all that, and it goes all the way up. It's an uphill battle. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult often, more times than not. Now, trafficking and smuggling, there is a difference. Trafficking, in the first column, is a crime against a person's basic right to freedom. They have been captured. They are being forced to do this against their will. They are coerced, either by physical harm to themselves or death or to somebody else. Exploitation, they don't just work an 8 to 5 job, they're working almost 24 hours around the clock. And these persons are viewed as victims. Smuggling is different. Smuggling is, it's a business transaction. Basically, I would hire you to get me over the border. And once I'm over the border, our transaction's done. You go about your business, I go about mine, welcome to America. And there's no coercion, because I sought her out because she's a smuggler. Basically, that would lines in your yard, no criminal trespassing, no soliciting. If you were a big dog, you may or may not have a real dog or not, but have that sign up. She gets me over your fence. And once I'm there, I go about my business, and she goes back, gets her money, and she's going to bring like a couple other 100 people out there to do another smuggling job. That is very common. Sex trafficking. Child sex trafficking. Most of child sex trafficking, we're dealing with child pornography, child prostitution, arranged dates, escort services are very common, especially in the bigger cities. Believe it or not, some of these businesses are designed to have special cabs or Ubers set up for those victims. Certain hotels set up rooms, block rooms off for victims, for clients, and everyone gets a piece of that money. Around the airport and the shipping ports, kids are everywhere. Adults are everywhere. I've got a friend of mine who's with the Houston Police now. We went through college together, and he just needed something different. He was on patrol forever. He was smart enough not to ever promote. He says, I'm enjoying working. I don't want to be a supervisor. And if you've ever been a supervisor, you know what I'm talking about. He got into human trafficking division with HPD. This was like 17, 16 years ago. He has not left. He says, every day I go to work, I'm out there saving someone's life. And he said, I cannot tell you how many kids and adults we've taken just out of Houston, Harris County, Galveston County, Kemah, Webster, Friendswood, Stratford, all those areas. If anyone's from the Houston area, he says it's thousands of people. And most of them are not from Texas. They just showed up here, they were sold, bought, traded, whatever, and put it down. And he said, when I got into this, a week later, he said, this is my career. And I said, if you have that much passion, and you know you're never going to run out of business for something like that, number one, there's a problem that we need to address. And we need to start having these conversations. Now, talking about this stuff now, we're 20 years too late. But we need to start somewhere. So when I get to the East Texas stuff, I'm gonna hopefully surprise some of y'all what's going on out there. Sex trafficking, it is critical to understand the difference between being prostituted and being in prostitution. There is a difference. If a person in prostitution is held in service through psychological manipulation or physical force, they are now considered trafficking victims. If they can show this to us or to the courts that, hey, I had no choice, this is what I was doing, I met this guy, and next thing I know, I'm being fed drugs, I'm getting hooked on drugs, and I'm being forced to do this, and I was in fear of my life or fear of my family's life, they're a trafficking victim. So very seldom when you see prostitution cases where we go out and we see someone who's just being a prostitute for the sake of being. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but typically there's going to be what I call a handler or a pimp or a controller there. That's when we know that we're dealing with trafficking in Texas or in this area. Okay, so earlier we talked about examples of labor trafficking. And the first one we talk about is debt bondage. And of those, you think about agriculture, field labor, construction labor, sweatshops, domestic servitude, maids, servants, housekeepers, and then of course child labor. So agriculture bondage, let me talk about this real quick. We don't have a whole lot of agriculture in this part of Texas. I know we got the piney woods and we've got, certain agricultural pockets here. Do what? Roses. Roses, yes, we have roses. Yes, we do. Sorry, we do have roses. I'm from Longview, I forgot that, sorry. Valentine's Day's coming up, so yeah, that's a plug right here, Valentine's Day coming up. Down in the valley, all right, they will go to the border on a daily basis and bring in several hundred people. At the end of the day, if these folks aren't working, or they stop working and they try to walk off the field, they're simply shot, left there, they get a truck, they go back to the border, get some new workers, and bring them over. I cannot tell you how many John Doe's unsolved homicides they have right now along the border in the Southwest Valley, around Hidalgo County, McAllen, all that. They got hundredly basis. All right, like I said earlier, I used the word commodity. They're not viewed as people. They will work for hours and hours, days on days, and they don't get a break, and they have to produce. Now, earlier I talked about labor trafficking. This is kitchen. This kid, they found him in a kitchen in East Texas. He was working about 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. The official story was he was homeschooled, and then the other story was he got his GED. The kid there is only 14, so either go with crap. So we got in there, we found out he was from Nicaragua or Venezuela or somewhere. He was bought and sold a couple times. Eventually when we got a correct translator, because just speaking Spanish does not necessarily mean you can speak someone's language from South America. I know that's a misnomer. In fact, the state of Texas gives officers 3 days of intermediate Spanish, and we're supposed to come out speaking fluent Spanish like Dora the Explorer or something like that. It just doesn't happen. We got his story, and he had been bought and paid for. Family was back in his country. He had a choice to either get into trafficking or join the army. And he already had brothers in the army that had died in the civil revolutions going on down there. And this kid got into trafficking, he was pimped out, and then he was sold into labor trafficking, and they found him just happened to be in a kitchen one day when they were doing a health inspection or something like that. And then the entire lid of this case came open and we all got activated. So it happens. It happens all the time, more times than not. Debt bondage. This is a picture I found of some kids in India. I'll give you a global perspective. As soon as they're walking, they're put to work. You won't see it on CNN or MSNBC, but this has been going on for like the last 100 years in India, okay? Because they work on a caste system. And if you're in a particular caste, you're a commodity. If not, you're a buyer. And this is just one example of a dozen countries where this happens. Sweatshops, unfortunately, they're all around Texas. We see them in the bigger cities. These are kids, immigrants, working several hours a day on not just clothing, but it could be food assembly lines, could be factories, wherever. Right now they're investigating Apple. How many of you guys have Apple products in here? Yeah, the cobalt we get to build our phones has been products of child labor in different countries like Jakarta and stuff like that. The other one we looked at was Microsoft. They're having some issues right now. I forget who the third, Hershey's. How many of you guys like Hershey's? Yeah, cocoa beans. They don't come from US, they're brought in. Child exploitation, so they're getting hammered pretty hard right now by a lot of sanctions and all that, so we're trying to fix these problems. American companies are like, well, we had no idea, but hey, have a chocolate bar, here you go. They're actually having to pay a lot of fines and having to rethink some of their policies right now. The most common one you'll see in East Texas is construction labor. And if you're in an area where they're building homes or building an apartment complex or assisted living or schools, these things don't build themselves, okay? And every now and then when I was on patrol or I'd be going to another city to train in something like this, I was always amazed how I would see, like I like to drive around people's towns and just kind of see where things are. And I would see like 20 or 40 guys, mostly Hispanic, sitting on a curb or in a restaurant, and then a truck pulls up and it's one of our local construction guys, and like 90 guys jump in the back of the truck. And how the suspension doesn't break is beyond me. But they got their tools and they go out and they do a job. And hey, you can hammer, you can saw, you can do a roof, great. Put you in line for the day. They pay them cash when they're done for the day, cut them loose, and what we don't know, the other side of the story, is those 20 guys are being trafficked, and most of those 20 guys are squatting in a 2-bedroom apartment somewhere, sharing a bathroom with 18 to 15 people in there, working off their debt to come to America. So this is a real problem. So I'm going to ask you all a little quiz real quick. Where is the largest site for human trafficking in the United States, you think? Yeah, one? Oh, Texas, huh? I'm going to go smaller than that. It's an event. Super Bowl. Who said Super Bowl? Wow, okay. You're right. Super Bowl. Super Bowl has a location and droves of people come out for human trafficking, either to sell, buy, or have sex with victims. All right, I'm going to give you all some stats here. Human trafficking Super Bowl, there were 133 arrests resulting from a 12-day undercover Texas trafficking task force. Through Super Bowl, this is 2011, I got a more recent one next. 6 children were recovered from the 2010 Super Bowl weekend in Miami. 100,000 was the approximate number of Americans, children, who are victims of commercial sex trafficking and prostitution each year. This is like the Mecca. This is like the Super Bowl for trafficking. They all just kind of converge there. In 17, 183 sex buyers and 9 sex traffickers were arrested in Houston at the Houston, Texas, the 2017 Super Bowl. It's a problem. Okay, let me go back to the Super Bowl pick here. First of all, it was a great game. I enjoyed watching it. Commercials were a little flat. I spent a little time in Kansas City, so I was rooting, of course, for East Texas, Mahomes, and all that was great. Wasn't sure they were going to pull it off until the last quarter, but they did. During the game, I had friends. We have cop chats and all that. And we were just getting numbers about just people getting popped. Undercover cops posing as children and people signing up online, trying to set up a hookup or set up a rendezvous or something like that. And I would say there were a couple hundred arrests before the first half of the game on-site inside that Super Bowl. It's just unbelievable what people will do with the internet. They have these apps, they were chatting, they were trying to set stuff up. And most of the time now, thank goodness, is online, it's officers. They're talking to cops, which is a good thing, you know. It gets a little weird when we get a call from like another state and says, hey, there's someone in Longview, or hey, there's someone in Tyler, they're chatting with us, you know, we're gonna set up a meeting, and then, you know, we find like a place for the bad guy to meet us, and then instead of finding a small child or an adult, they're finding like 12 cops in there, and we have a conversation, and then we go to jail. Hopefully no one gets injured. Yes, sir?
I hear and read a lot about groups that will step forward and will advocate for the victims. Here, politicians pay a lot of lip service to this.
Yeah.
But we don't ever seem to be making much progress in resolving this.
Well, we make a tremendous amount of progress simply because if it's a minor victim, we will never hear about it in the mainstream media unless it's like a real, like 6,000 kids. For a couple hundred kids or local trafficking issues, if it makes the news, it's great, but the problem is Texas statute, if you're a minor, we can't publicize any information about that minor in the media. And typically when it's a victim of trafficking or sexual assault or family violence or a combination of any of those, they are most of the time given a pseudonym, and unless it's just really big news, the victim's family, and the prosecution prefer not to publicize everything in the local media. So they are making progress. I mean, I'm going to show you a picture in just a second where they found a couple hundred people in a stash house on the border. That was a couple of years ago, and that's just one day that Border Patrol's catching, local law enforcement's catching, and we're working on task force to find them and all that. So It's one of those that we have quiet, silent victories. We just can't broadcast it to the rest of the world because, I mean, if you find out, I mean, for example, let's say that we find out that there were some trafficking victims in a particular church or school. All right, let's say it's here in Thailand. Let's say it's in Longview. What does that do to the general public? They're gonna freak out. Yeah, they're gonna like, oh, I gotta pull my kid out of there. Oh, I'm gonna homeschool them. You know, we're gonna go to another church and all that. And the fact is lightning struck it. That doesn't mean you tear down the building. It just means we need to find out what happened. Was it being facilitated through that, or was that just a meeting spot? The two places that we found most of our human trafficking folks was Walmart. Why Walmart? It's not because they have the best prices. It's a joke. They're 24/7, parking lot. Okay? The other ones is Lowe's and these other big facilities, like the mall here on Broadway. It's a perfect place to meet and negotiate a price. Why? Because people are coming and going. Nobody pays anyone attention. Our goal is to get in as fast as we can and get out just as fast, especially if you're a guy shopping at Christmas, right? It's like a surgical strike. We're in and out. No one's paying attention. All right? Let me get through this real quick. I'm running short on time. Okay, so in East Texas, here we go. In Texas, this is at the border. Police rescue more than 100 immigrants in a Texas stash house. Basically, we have a law now for stash houses. It's not dope, it's for human trafficking. A law that came out this year is we're going to go after the homeowner or the owner of the property, as well as the people that were holding the human traffickers. And it's going to be up to them to prove in court they had no idea, well, I own this property and I leased it out. And too bad. Too bad. You're going to have to prove up that you were completely oblivious to this. Then if the house is paid for, guess what? Who can seize the house? We can. Yeah, I will tell you, not like TV, I'm not seizing any mansions. I usually get these really crappy houses. I mean, literally, my 5-year-old could build a better clubhouse than some of these homes that were CNCs. But it's a process, all right? We're basically starting to hold more and more people accountable. It's not just the trafficker anymore. So keep in mind, we talk about vulnerable populations. Now, human trafficking is about exploiting a person's vulnerability. There is not a consistent type of profile of a trafficking victim. On TV, they always say, oh, we've got this white female and she's in her 20s and she's on drugs. That's one. That's one of a billion. Okay, we have boys, girls, adolescent, adult. We have elderly folks that are trafficked. It's everybody. Victims can be anyone. So let me jump to East Texas real quick. I'm trying to be aware of my time. So let's talk about something close to home. In East Texas, we don't have, at least in the mainstream, when I'm training this course or other people, I don't spend a lot of time on, how many of y'all saw Liam Neeson taken? You know, his daughter got kidnapped by smugglers. And then if it wasn't bad enough, there was Taken 2, and Taken 3, Taken 4. Okay, that is Hollywood, and it's just my example of bad parenting. If you let your kid get abducted 4 times, you suck as a parent. I'm sorry, that's just bad parenting. Something that's a little more, just gotta remember that. I'll let you use that joke, it's okay. Something that's more realistic for us is a term called DMST, which is domestic minor sex trafficking. These are kids and adults that are being forced into labor or prostitution. Well, actually, it's just prostitution for DMST locally, out of their own homes, at schools, churches, in these hotels around here. And for a long time, what this looked like or how we were going to get involved in it, but just to kind of break it down, I found this on the web last night. Approximately 79,000 minors and youth are victims of sex trafficking in Texas annually. Approximately 234,000 workers and victims are labor trafficking. There are currently an estimated 313,000 victims of human trafficking in Texas. Now, these are the reported numbers. These are the ones we know about. This is that tip of the iceberg. We have no idea what's below the ocean. We have no idea how big that ice mass is. Traffic exploits approximately 600 million from victims of labor trafficking in Texas. Minor and youth sex trafficking costs in Texas for us for crime victims compensation, times and investigations, relocation, medical service, trauma services, around $6.6 billion a year, taxpayer dollars. Okay? This is the real thing for us in East Texas. This is a 45-minute video. I'm not going to show you all that. Okay. So let me get to my stats real quick. Okay. So domestic minor sex trafficking, basically they're typically younger than 18 years of age. They're very vulnerable than adults due to the inability to control their environments. They can be trafficked by anyone, including their parents. Mom and dad are on dope. Mom and dad are, swingers, and they're renting their kids out or pimping their kids out, or they're whatever. I've heard a billion excuses. It doesn't matter. Coaches, teachers, boyfriends, girlfriends. It doesn't matter. Okay? This is local stuff. I'm not talking about Liam Neeson now. Any child is vulnerable to a person who promises to meet his or her emotional needs. Most of these kids that fall into this population have run away. They're at risk. They have an unstable home life. They have a drug addiction, or they're being abused at home and they just flee and they get out. Victims of DMST are typically forced to engage in commercial sex acts, including street prostitution, escort services, internet prostitution, exotic dancing and stripping, and pornography. Most of these kids, like I said earlier, 1 in 3 will be contacted by a pimp for sex trafficking on the streets after they run away within 48 hours. Tyler, Longview, Lindale, no exception. All right? So we did a study about a year or two ago. I'm still working on it. And we contacted a bunch of kids, not we, but the For the Silent got in touch, and they were doing a 10-week program to basically work with at-risk kids who we thought were in the highest category for being victims of domestic minor sex trafficking. So we compiled all this data. My job is to code it and look at it and make sense of it. And when I fleshed it out, the average age right now in East Texas that's being approached, or we figured out was the highest risk, is 13. Okay? 13 years of age. Closest 12 and 14, and then it kind of flattens out because 11, they're still at home with mom and dad. They're not quite on their own as teenagers. But 15, 16, 17, they get a little older. They're able to testify. They can identify their attacker. Some of them can fight back. So the ethnicity of this group that we have, Caucasian, African American, Hispanic, Asian, mixed. Oh my God, mixed. These were the kids that identified, but one day they were black, the next day they were Hispanic, then they were white, and then they were alien. I had no idea. So we created a generic thing called mixed. I said, whatever, you can be mixed. And then a couple that just didn't answer the question. So we saw predominantly, this is kind of representative of East Texas, of the kids we saw, the kids that were involved. And then these were the locations we found them at. Middle schools. Okay? Here. Longview. Kilgore. Everywhere. Okay? One of the things I tell communities when I teach this course, your zip code, your occupation, your gated community, your apartment complex, wherever you live, it's like a virus. You are not immune to it. Okay? You're not immune to it. Community organization-based high school, some were in juvenile justice, they were JDC. Most of them were middle school, others, some were homeschooled, some were in between school and all that. Some were on the street that got contacted and got swept up into this program.
Am I hearing this, that kids were pulled out of middle school? Out of the school?
They were truant. Yeah, they were on the streets. And, yeah, or because of their behavior, their frequent runaway truancy, they were at a high degree of falling into this victim category for truants, or for human trafficking. All right, go ahead.
I mean, just clarify,
Sure.
are you saying this, they are contacted at the middle school, or they are middle school students, or both?
They were middle school students at the time. They reported being at a certain grade in middle school, and they were identified as being at risk, and then we put them through a program to see if they would be able to hopefully avoid this scenario if they ever came in contact with it again, or if it was in their future. So just to break down some of the stats here, and I apologize for the small lettering, but the first question we asked them was, do you know someone who's been a victim of human trafficking or prostitution? Of the respondents, 23% said, yeah. I know someone. Yeah, my girlfriend, my best friend, whatever. Oh yeah, I know who they are. And they weren't lying. They were legitimate about it. Their answers were just authentic. So 23% of the people in this population said, yeah, I know someone is. Then we followed up with another question. Have you been the victim of a human trafficking, prostitution, forced sex situation? 17% of them said yes. 11 to 18 in East Texas. All right? So that got everyone's attention. We started rolling out these programs. The next question is, well, would you consider calling the police for help? There's your answer. So as a Texas police officer, as a former sergeant, this speaks volumes to me that we're not reaching our kids in the schools, and we're not this. I can spend all day talking about DARE and drugs and stranger danger, which by the way is not really relevant anymore because 90% of your users are inside the homes. We've had to rethink that. But when they don't know to call the police, or they don't want to call the police, or they're afraid to call the police, that's 70% of victims we don't even know exist. So we have a problem with that right there too. So we had to change our dialogue. So for 10 weeks they had a program, and we gave them a pre-test and a post-test. The first day they'd answer some questions about a fictitious scenario and a pimp that found this girl who ran away. And we asked her, would you be able to identify a trafficker? In the pre-test, 12% said that guy in the story was her boyfriend. A majority figured out they were a pimp immediately after the post-test and never shot up significantly. Some of them said, well, he's just a nice guy trying to keep her off the streets. That number went down a little bit. Not sure. Initially, they had no idea, and then it dropped to about 3% at the end of it. So we made an impact, but there are still some kids, and typically the kids who didn't figure it out were the younger ones. They just didn't understand. All right? So we kind of started working with that and trying to figure out, craft those conversations and those discussions with the kids. Then we had a section on grooming, and we said, all right, would you be able to understand if a trafficker was going to groom you? You know, again, middle school kids. And the situation was the pimp fell short on rent, and he needed money, and he said, hey, you know what, this guy's going to give me some money, but he really likes you. What do you think? Go have sex with him, he'll give us the money for the rent, and everything will be cool. And that was the question posed to the kids. Most of them said, when was this going to happen? Oh, well, it happened when he was going to fall short on rent. It was just a spur of the moment thing. Of course, it wasn't. After the post-test, that green bar right there, if I had my laser pointer, that would help. They realized that this whole thing had been planned the whole time. Okay? Even before the trafficker met the victim. This is their modus operandi. This is their MO to get them in. They said some of them, it was spur of the moment. They met the day he met the victim, and then initially in the pre-test, they didn't know that number went down, but there were still some people who were confused about it. So again, it's creating that awareness and having those conversations with our students. The next one is, if the victim sleeps with a stranger the suspect knows, then is he going to ask the victim to have sex with other guys? They all said yes on that one, probably. Not ask the victim, they broke even. And then a couple of them still didn't know what they would do. They said, well, maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't, and there were some open conversations about that, and all I did was report the numbers. But this is very telling because it tells me right now that we're not talking to our children about this. We're not having these conversations because they're uncomfortable, or we think realistically, oh, that happens, you know, in the inner city, it doesn't happen out here. This is all East Texas data. All right? All these kids are the kids you see walking around the city. Okay? You see them in the mall, you see them in your church, you see them everywhere. The grooming process is how well or how vulnerable did you think the victim was or wasn't during that story? They all agreed, most of them, that they thought the victim was vulnerable at first, almost 50%. That number went up a little bit above 50 on the post-test after they had some training and they were given the same test at the end. I don't think the victim was vulnerable, and the couple's still not sure. Okay, so we have to go further. We have to start breaking the paradigms in the culture. And a lot of this test was basically around what we call sex trafficking power and control wheel. And all it is years and years of empirical study that we look for these things, and officers should be looking for them. Intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, sexual abuse, using privilege to find your children, treats them like a servant, defines gender roles, nationality superiority if they're here from another country. Economic abuse, coercion, which is a big problem right now in a lot of the bigger cities. But all of these are tactics used by your traffickers. Go ahead, sir.
Yep. Recently, I've been reading some articles, mainly from the political left, about nationally legalizing prostitution. It's a victimless crime. It can be regulated. In your opinion,
no.
What would be the
There's
effect?
always a victim because someone in that scenario doesn't want to be doing what they're doing. No rational, free-thinking person would want to do that. It will increase unplanned pregnancies, it'll increase the spread of STDs, and it will create a lot of problems for a lot of stable communities. It'll never happen. It'll never happen. It's every now and then I read those same types of arguments and all that, and at the end of the day, it's common sense. We're not. I mean, if some of these other states want to try it, Nevada, they have a section where they do it outside Las Vegas, something like that. But even then, it's so controlled and it's so ridiculous. I've never been. That's one place I've never been is Las Vegas. I have no desire to go there. Now I say that, they're probably going to send me there for a conference now, so I probably just jinx myself. But I will bring my wife and kids, so that'll be good. Yes, sir.
These young kids that would not report this to the police, do you think that's a part of cultural conditioning?
Yes. Yes. He asked, is that a part of cultural conditioning? And it's not just cultural, it's just kids. My kids, I got 2 teenagers, and my daughter's about to become a teenager, my first daughter. They are not impressed that they're not, my dad was a police sergeant, he thinks he knows everything, A lot of it's a teenage thing, trying to push the boundaries and all that. Yeah, they're rebellious. I think with a victim, a lot of people don't understand, is when let's say, for example, I get a victim, and we have a case with a victim, and let's say you're my victim. Give me 1 second. And we take our child to the Child Advocacy Center, okay? There's been this belief forever that we just do the one interview, and one and done, we're out. We don't get the outcry, oh man, it either didn't happen or she's just not ready. Well, we've seen enough studies now to do what we call multi-sessional interviews, where today we may just have the report. Next week she may scream at me and run out. The next day we'll talk about the trauma. The next time we'll talk about the abuse. When we finally talk about it, guess what? She's going to recant. Because she's literally seeing the words and reliving all that information and all that trauma again. She's going to shut down. We'll build some rapport, and then she'll reaffirm the recantation. This is a process. It's not an event. And that's been something we've been trying to sell people. It's like, look, I can't do all this in an hour. It's just not going to happen. It could be several weeks, several months of intense therapy before we're even ready to move forward and to give a judge a case like this. You had your question, sir?
Yes, it sounds like educational. You taking this information to the school system?
Oh yeah, we got it from the schools.
And what kind of feedback, cooperation you get?
On some of the schools, they continue the program. Some of the schools saw it and got really freaked out and said, let us reassess and talk, and they never got back to us. Because we actually had one student in a high school said, I'm currently the victim of being trafficked, and that created all kinds of problems. It just depends on the school district. This program that they're doing, it's called I Have a Voice. It's around the entire nation, and basically it's targeting for those kids who are in the highest population or risk.
How about publishing it?
I'm working on it. I'm trying to get it out there.
Where you get your cooperation and ones you don't?
Well, it's getting that, and it's also getting, because they're minors, there's a lot of red tape with the
The school system.
I'm working on it, I promise. That's an ongoing conversation. Yes, ma'am.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Yes.
And that sounds very much like human trafficking.
It was.
And
it
involved very powerful people.
Hollywood and the movie roles and the $1 million and the drugs. Oh yeah, that's coming out. That's coming. That they haven't even cracked that in yet. That's probably going to happen in the next couple of months. We're going to find out all kinds of weird details and all that. And there's a lot of people.
Because it's been so quiet recently, I just didn't know whether it's just it's being suppressed.
I think for me, when I don't hear anything, I think the investigation's ongoing. And if you've been in this line of work as long as most of us have, we're not going to present a case until we're absolutely sure we're ready to go, and that just takes time. We have to have all our ducks in a row. We have to have all our witnesses, have all our warrants and everything lined up, so we don't get something thrown at a trial on a technicality or something like that. So it just takes time. Yes, ma'am, sir.
I don't want to take too much of your time.
No, go ahead.
I have a question and a comment.
Okay.
I don't know if this is just a coincidence, but the cover story in this month's issue of National Geographic is about the last slave ship to dock in the United States. It was in 1860.
Okay, it wasn't locally like Carnival Cruise or something. Okay. Don't cancel your trip.
I'm not
Yes, sir.
I mean, I just mean, it boggles my mind that 160 years, that was when Abraham Lincoln was running for president. 160 years later, slavery is alive and well. But I was going to ask, and by the way, I highly recommend that article. It's in the library here.
Okay.
I sense from what's been said that there seems to be a gross naivety among a lot of the children population. When I was growing up, a long time ago, I mean, my father and everybody's father went to school with me. The things was that some grown up, if you children walking down the street, they would say, hey kids, you want some candy? And they try to get them close to them and give them some candy, and then they might grab them, put them in their car or something.
Yeah, now we have Facebook.
And, yeah, well, things didn't exist when I was growing up either.
Right.
But, or sometimes the guy would be in a car and he'd say, hey kids, you want to take a ride or you want some candy? And kid would get in the car and ride away. This is the way it happened when I was growing up. But my father warned me, don't take any candy or any food from a stranger. Don't get in a stranger's car.
Right.
And every other kid, most of them that I went to school with, their fathers told them something similar. Now
Yeah.
these kids
There's a disconnect.
seem to be so naive. I
Well-
get a sense of mass naivety.
Most of it is they're not looking up. They're doing this the whole time.
If you get what I'm trying to say.
Oh, I do. There's a disconnect, and we've had a generation or two since your dad's time where we have essentially let social media and let the media and other kids raise our kids. And, you know, part of it too is these guys, these predators, they just have to throw something out on the internet, and it's like fishing. They're fishing in a barrel. They just have to wait for the right kid to come along and respond, groom them, set up a meet, and they're going to do what they're going to do.
It's no different than.
No,
they had
they
in
just
my day.
want to get off their couch.
In my day, they did it in person.
Right, now it's all through cyberspace until they set up a meeting or something. There's another question over there. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to make a comment about the main question of why they're not saying they did not report to police.
Right.
A longtime teacher of middle school,
Mhm.
and they're admitted that they're separated from their parents.
Right.
But they're not independent enough yet. They are extremely vulnerable, which begin with. And then for them to have that kind of courage to step out and report to anyone, not just to the police, it is almost beyond their capabilities. And I think they feel a lot of, nobody would believe me, and they're going up against this person who is probably an adult and much more powerful. And
Yeah.
I just think there's nowhere to go, not just the police. but
And we're having to jump out in front and change that narrative now. Law enforcement, advocates, child protective services, the prosecutors, anyone that can help or see or intervene or look for the signs of someone being trafficked or prostituted locally. We have a responsibility. And one of the things I'll close on, I know we're out of time, is if we hear a question I always get, I usually get to it later in this presentation, is they say, well, what if I see something and I report it and I'm wrong? You're fine. You have what we call qualified immunity. All right? The catch is if you suspect it, see it, and you don't report it, it's called a what in Texas? Starts with an F. F. Felony. It's a felony. You have to report it. You can be anonymous. You can just say, hey, this is not right, whatever. Tell us. You know, I would rather have 100 calls and you all be wrong and then not get the one that you needed to be right on and lose a kid. So that's kind of where we're going. And again, having these conversations, getting in with the children and with the adults and saying, hey, you know, it's okay, here's a place. And we have that in Tyler. You have the Tyler Police Department, which are doing, those guys are awesome, doing a great job. Smith County Sheriff's Department, the Smith County, sorry, I'm running on 5 hours sleep. Baby's got an ear infection, so. Smith County DA's office, we also have the Attorney General's office just down the street, like you can literally see it, is the For the Silent, and they are a grassroots program that goes out into the community and looks for these kids and tries to bring them in and tries to get them help. They're a nonprofit, so look them up on the internet. They're always looking for volunteers, they're looking for donations like any other one, 501c3. See what they're doing, because a lot of the stuff I have today would not be possible without them. Am I good? Okay, she's standing there like,
Yeah.
I'm about to ring the bell. Thank y'all very much.